Good morning. My name is Eric McGhee, and I am a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for today's program. Hopefully everybody can see me and I've got enough light shining on me. When I planned for this and located myself in my house, I thought the only way there could be a problem with this location is if the sky was orange and the sun was blocked out. So clearly we're all going through challenging times, but I hope everyone's safe and well. PPIC has just released a report titled How Greater Vote by Mail Influences California Voter Turnout. As just a matter of housekeeping to start, I'd like to invite everybody to submit questions that they might have during the course of the presentation to this email address you see on your screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And that's how we're going to handle all the questions that you might have. Hold on one second. All right, so as I said, we released a report today called How Greater Vote by Mail Influences California Voter Turnout. The report and its technical appendices, as well as the slides that you're going to see from today's presentation, are all available on our website at ppic.org. I should also note that the research and event are supported with funding from Craig Newmark Philanthropy, so we'd like to thank them for their support of this work. The report was co-authored, in addition to me, it was co-authored by Jennifer Pollack and Mindy Romero. Mindy Romero will be joining us later for a conversation and a discussion of the key takeaways. But before that point, I'll be walking you through some of the key findings. Also, just one note that I forgot to mention is if you send in questions to that email address, again, the email address is ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. We would appreciate if you'd include your name and organization along with your question. So without further ado, I'd like to go through this presentation. I don't think it's news to anybody that we're in the middle of a pandemic and that presents some pretty unprecedented challenges for voting, among other unprecedented challenges, of course. The voting in person risks transmission of the virus in a way that voting remotely does not. In addition, poll workers run those same risks of being in contact with other people, but they encounter even more people during the course of a day. And in addition, poll workers tend to come from more vulnerable populations, especially seniors. So not only is voting going to be more risky than it would be before the pandemic, it will be more difficult to staff the same number of in-person locations. The common solution to this problem is to encourage more voting by mail. If you're voting through the mail, you're not coming in contact with a person and you are less likely to be exposed. Many states, most states actually, are encouraging or to some degree facilitating higher voting by mail for this fall. Only a small handful are actually actively resisting the transition. And California has been out in front of other states in deciding to mail every voter a vote by mail ballot by default. So everybody in the state is going to get, who's registered to vote, is going to get a vote by mail ballot. In addition, many counties will be limiting in-person options, and in exchange for limiting those in-person options, they're going to offer more unstaffed drop boxes and early voting options. Unstaffed drop boxes being kind of like a normal mailbox, except that it goes directly to the registrar of voters. So the question is naturally what happens when a county shifts to this kind of model? Can we try and anticipate it at all? In this report, we use California's experience with a reform called the Voters' Choice Act to try and inform this inform the transition to this new model. So we're going to look at, under this Voters' Choice Act, who votes compared to counties that didn't adopt the Voters' Choice Act, when and how do they vote, and then offer some conclusions and policy recommendations at the end before we go to a conversation. Mindy, Romero, and I will have a conversation, and then we'll have some Q&A. So we argue in this report that some approximation of the pandemic model of voting has been tested, and it's been tested through this Voters' Choice Act reform that I just mentioned. It's been used in 15 counties. Most of those counties are up in the north of the state. The first wave of counties to adopt the reform came in 2018. It was 5 counties up in the north: San Mateo, Madera, Napa, Sacramento, and Nevada. And then in 2020, 10 more counties made the switch, including 2 large ones, Orange County and Los Angeles County down in the south. With the addition of those extra 10 counties in 2020, there are now a small majority of the registered voters in the state who are covered by this system. The basic model of the Voters' Choice Act is, as we will be doing in the fall this year, all voters receive a vote by mail ballot by default. In addition, in a Voters' Choice Act county, vote centers replace normal polling places, and a vote center is a larger, professionally staffed location that any voter in the county can go to, unlike a polling place where you have to go to the one that's in your neighborhood. And some amount of early voting at these vote centers, plus drop boxes, must be made available under the Voters' Choice Act. So there are alternatives for voting earlier than election day if you want them, and actually alternatives to mailing in your ballot. And we argue this is the closest comparison to the voting that we're going to see certainly in California this fall, and it's an approximation of what you might see in a number of other states. It certainly provides us some kind of context for what we might expect. So who votes under this new system? Well, the basic answer is more people do. Turnout. So what here, this plot shows you the numbers broken down in 2 ways. First, the change in the Voters' Choice Act counties in the primary of 2018. So for those first 5 counties that made the switch. And then the change in the 2020 primary, which includes those original 5 plus the other 10. The way that the estimates we offer here are, it's important to note, changes. So this is the change that we saw, accounting for the differences between the VCA counties and the non-VCA counties from before the reform, as well as any kind of general change over time between the 2016 fall election and each of these primaries, which obviously there is a big change in turnout normally for that transition. So and then the other way we break it down is in person and by mail. So this is how the registrant preferred to vote when they signed up for voting. It's important to note that even though they said they preferred to vote in person, they still, if they were in a VCA county, they still received a vote by mail ballot by default. So they still were subject to all the same rules in the VCA counties. They just had said when they signed up that they preferred to vote in person. And we see a bigger increase in turnout for those in-person voters and the by mail voters, but we see some increase for both. However, that increase masks some variation across different demographic groups. So here we have, again, we have on the left these in-person voters and on the right, the by mail voters. We still have the primary 2018 and the primary 2020 broken out. But here we also break it out by different demographic groups. Now these groups can overlap with each other. So young people are also more likely to be new registrants, for instance. So these are not mutually exclusive, but they're just kind of breaking it down to see how each of these different groups behaved. The basic pattern that we saw in the last graph is visible here too, where in-person had a larger increase on average than by mail, but clearly there's some variation. And there are a few groups where we see potentially some cause of concern. So for instance, in-person voters who are, I got my pointer here, in-person voters who requested their ballot materials in a language other than English, didn't really see much of an increase in turnout in either of these 2 elections. Similarly, renters who were by mail also did not see, and actually saw a very small decrease. We also, in one election but not the other, so in the primary 2020 election but not the primary 2018 election, young people had some decline in turnout, and new registrants also some decline in turnout. So we're seeing, again, so just, we saw a robust increase for those groups in 2018, but we didn't see it survive to 2020. And that's just a cause for concern. And finally, Latinos and Asian Americans in the 2018 primary, in those first 5 counties, if they were by mail voters, we saw a little bit of a decrease. So again, just a point of potential concern. It's also worth noting we are able, with the data and with the research design we have, we're able to say whether there are any partisan differences in the transition to this higher vote by mail system. And the basic answer is no. So we've divided it up here. The red is Republicans, the blue is Democrats, and these are again changes. So if we had a large partisan difference in the impact of this reform, we would expect to see big differences between those 2 bars. They'd be very different lengths. There are occasionally some differences, but they're not consistently in one direction or the other, and generally they're pretty small. So this supports a lot of other research that has also been done that comes to similar conclusions, but it's just comforting to know that there is no partisan effect of this kind of change. So that's who votes. The next is when and how do voters vote? So we were able to get data from 2 VCA counties, Sacramento and Orange County. They're very different in many respects, but we were reassured by the fact that the results that we show you here were very consistent between the 2 counties. And this just shows among those who actually did cast a ballot. So just before we were showing who voted and who didn't. This is among those who voted, how did they cast their ballot? And then in this particular case, when did they cast their ballot? So the x-axis here, the horizontal axis shows the number of days before election day. So on the far right over here, 0 is election day itself, and then it goes all the way up to the 29 days before, which is when the vote by mail ballots are mailed out. And we can see that the ballots are returned in a fairly even distribution throughout the whole pre-election day period. So for those mailing in ballots, they send them in kind of at a steady rate all throughout the weeks before election day. The graph at the bottom here is for those who dropped off their ballot at an unstaffed drop box. And we can see that these ballots are cast much closer to election day, and in fact, quite a few, about 60% of them are cast on election day itself. So that's much higher concentration near the end of the election season. That basic pattern consists, but becomes even sharper for those who dropped off their ballot at a vote center, or those who went to the vote center and voted a replacement ballot. So they actually filled out their ballot at the vote center. These voters cast their ballots right around on election day at very high rates, over 60%. So it gets more, as you get away from the mail balloting, the mailing in the ballot, you get a much higher concentration near election day itself. This graph then breaks down the method of voting by demographic groups. So this breaks it into those who got their ballot materials in English and those who got it in some other language. The foreign language registrants are more likely to use mail-in voting. So we saw earlier that the ones who do vote in person or prefer to vote in person had a little bit of trouble with the transition. Well, we also see that in general, those who are foreign language registrants mail in their ballots. The same is true for seniors. Seniors compared to younger voters are more likely to mail in their ballots. And younger voters are more likely to actually cast a replacement ballot at the vote center. And then if we break it down by racial and ethnic groups, we don't see quite the same differences, though Latinos and non-Hispanic whites are somewhat more likely to mail in their ballots than to vote their ballots at a vote center or drop them off at a vote center. So what do we take from all of this? Well, first, turnout is generally higher under the VCA. So we found that in this report. Mindy and I also worked on a separate research project where we found the same basic thing, just looking at the 2018 primary and looking at turnout as a share of all eligible residents in a county. So this is, and others have also looked at this question, both in California and in other states, and they find basically the same thing, that turnout is generally a little bit higher under a VCA type reform. So that's promising. That should make us feel good. However, it does not guarantee the fall outcome. There's a lot of other variables that are going on here. And so we shouldn't rest on our laurels. In addition, certain groups have shown signs of needing some extra outreach. So we find that in-person foreign language registrants and by-mail renters in both of the primaries we examined didn't see the same increase in turnout. New and young registrants in the 2020 primary also didn't see much increase in turnout, or actually a decline. And Latinos and Asian Americans in the 2018 primary in those first 5 VCA counties also didn't see much increase if they were by mail. So how should we compensate for this? Well, the best method and content of outreach, it really depends on the group that we're talking about. There's not a one size fits all. So we recommend tailoring the message to the specifics of each group and what kinds of media they tend to consume. The other thing that is important to note is that mail voting tends to be very spread out. So when we're planning for the fall, those who mail in their ballots are likely to mail them in kind of all the way through the pre-election period. But those who use other methods, either voting in person or dropping off their ballots, tend to be more concentrated near election day. So if we want, for those who want to have that alternative voting experience, don't want to mail in their ballot, maybe are worried about mailing in their ballot, that it won't arrive on time, we may need to encourage them to do it as early as possible to reduce the risk of transmission. It's really important that we continue to have in-person options available for people, but it's also, I think, important to try and encourage people to vote early as much as possible so that we limit the contact and limit the risk of coronavirus transmission. So again, please submit your questions to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And at this point, I will, I think, stop sharing my screen. I'll give a second for people to absorb that email address again, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And then, and I think the next step here is we're going to bring Mindy Romero onto our Zoom call here. Mindy is, welcome Mindy. Mindy is the founder and director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy at USC. Those of you on this Zoom call who follow elections and election reform in California or even nationally know Mindy very well. She is a force of nature, and we're really honored to have her part of this project and part of this conversation today. So welcome, Mindy.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. The best introduction I've had all week.
Happy to oblige. So I think the first question that I would just throw out is whether you had any takeaways that you wanted to emphasize from this study that you would think were important, either that have been already made or that maybe weren't mentioned in the presentation.
Yeah, I think, well, first off, excellent presentation as always, Eric. You know, I think the nuance differences across groups are just really important to emphasize again, as you did in your presentation. So the whole, the whole point really of doing a study like this is to understand going into this COVID environment and into the 2020 general election is what to expect, but particularly how it may be different, right, across different subgroups, and how both advocates, election officials, and others can take these data to plan, hopefully as effectively as possible, given there are so many unknowns, but to look at the past and what we've learned thus far in California and how that can help us going forward. So I just emphasis again on the differences between 2018 and 2020, and particularly for young people and new voters, those areas that you've targeted, the subgroups that you've targeted in terms of needing particularly additional outreach and education. The headlines in terms of increasing voter turnout. It's very exciting. People can run with that, but we also want to make sure that folks are understanding that the idea here is also to target those groups that are also in need. And of course, as I know you have said, what we learned from the past is helpful for November, but also just a huge caveat in terms of the unique elements that are at play here in November with COVID and with the Voters' Choice Act can give us a very good sense of what to expect, but we have just the realities of everybody getting mail to vote by mail ballot in this context. So just want to make sure folks take that as that caveat. I think that's what I would emphasize after you've covered everything so thoroughly.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point about how what we were trying to do in this report was to provide the best information we could, given nobody was planning to be exactly here at this point in the election cycle with these kinds of transitions. I think the state had always hoped that that eventually all or almost all counties would switch to the Voters' Choice Act for a variety of reasons, but whether they did or not could take multiple election cycles, and maybe not all of them would ever switch. And so nobody really kind of expected that we would be making this kind of switch this soon and this quickly with as little planning as we're able to do. So I think it's important to note that what we presented here for the Voters' Choice Act was the result of a process that was much more deliberative, that played out over a longer period of time. It involved a lot of outreach to communities as a requirement of the law. So that was important as well. We weren't able, counties really aren't able to do any of that kind of stuff this time around. They're able to maybe do some approximation of it, but nothing like the actual VCA counties were able to do. So it's just, I think for that reason, it's important to keep in mind that we might not see quite such a rosy outcome this fall, and we should just kind of hope for the best, but plan for the worst. Yeah, and I also think in terms of this does give some sign of what we might expect for other states, but it's important to remember that in California we're going to be sending everybody a vote by mail ballot, and so it probably is the closest analog for those other states, which actually we mentioned in the report which other states are making that same transition. But for the other states that are sending everybody a vote by mail ballot by default, it gives you a sense of what that impact might be. There's a lot of states where voters are requesting vote by mail ballots at very high rates, but because they're kind of opting into that, we don't know quite whether it's going to have the same effect or not. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind, and just to understand some of the important ways that this fall election is going to be very strange and unprecedented.
Absolutely. But still, yeah. These data are, and the findings of the report and the work that you've done leading this study, I think is still very important to have and to emphasize not just a rosy picture, but also to emphasize the challenge that's ahead. We want to see some of this replicated and some of the positives of it replicated. There's work to do to see that, but it, as you said, shines a light on what's very possible.
Yeah. So I think it's the reform. It is very promising that the reform shows a positive effect on turnout, but we just need to be cognizant of the challenges. So Mindy, I know you've done some work recently on messaging, and I wondered if you wanted to maybe talk about the findings of your recent study that looked at some of the conclusions about the best messaging, since we talk in this report about how messaging is going to be and outreach to groups is going to be important. If you had some thoughts in the context of this report about what your separate report is finding.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, at my center, we just released, what day of the week is it now again? Just a couple of days ago, a study called Voter Messaging in the Time of COVID-19. It's available on our website. Eric, Dr. McGhee was a part of the study and contributed greatly in terms of its research design and its final form. So thank you, Eric. So in terms of that work, just in short, it was a representative, very large sample of California. We were able to look break out the data, the survey responses by race, ethnicity, disability status for voters with disability, look at some regional differences, LA specifically, and so forth. And we found that voters, first off, talking about COVID, do have still some significant concerns about COVID. We asked in the context of voting in November, which is important to point out, but in the context of voting in November, about 31% said they had a concern, period. Of everybody that responded, 14% said COVID was their concern, much higher for African Americans, and believe it or not, young people versus older people, and also higher for voters with disabilities. When it comes to voting method, which of course we're talking about today, we asked again in the context of this election, and this is a survey, right? So of course, actual behavior on the ground in the time of the election can be different, and it can be affected by unknowns between now and November, and such as the state and the impact of COVID. But what people are saying now is about 42% or so intend to mail in their ballot through the mail. Another, almost a third of all respondents are saying that they want to still vote in person, and that's in the COVID environment. They want to vote in person. And then another 17% say they want to take that vote by mail ballot that they get, not mail it, but drop it off at a drop box or in-person voting location, which is really important. So you can have a mail ballot, but a good chunk of Californians are going to want to drop those off and have a physical place. And so lots of reasons why they want that. To see it in the box, to feel that it's safe, not worry about USPS, that sort of thing. But back to in-person, much higher rates for voters of color, for young people, for voters with disabilities. And we're also hearing that for groups, period, that want to vote in person, about half of them want to vote early, either the weekend before or up to the week before Election Day, where that's available. And those are striking numbers. We can't get into some of the causal effects there, with this type of survey, but it stands to reason that potentially that the early, that wanting to vote early is because of concerns around COVID. And then just getting to messaging specifically. So outreaching to all these voters, as you said, Eric, is incredibly important. We found that the likelihood of turnout when we did some experimental treatments, the likelihood of turnout went up when people got what we call a voting options message that told them, you could mail in that vote by mail ballot, you can go in person, you can drop it off, all that sort of thing. But it went up when it came with a community empowerment language, talking about how voting is important for yourself and for your community. There was a big question about whether having a safety message, like should we tell voters it's safe? Should we not tell voters it's safe? Could that have a negative impact in some way? We found when that safety message, so the voting options, these are all your options. When you added a safety message and it came specifically from a trusted messenger, the impact went up and increased. So it seemed to matter if you talked about safety, it mattered if it came from a trusted messenger. And I think just the last thing I'll just mention is just not to get into the details, but if people are interested in the report, we also have more information about kind of their trusted sources of information, where they go and intending to go this November election, and quite significant differences across groups by race, ethnicity, disability status that might be of interest to some of the viewers.
Thank you, Mindy. That's great. It was a very interesting study. So I think now we are at the point where we want to move to the Q&A. And we have a few questions that have come in. The first question is, why do in-person voters see the biggest increases from vote by mail? Isn't isn't it surprising that we see it in those in-person voters instead of the by-mail voters? I think my response to that would be it's encouraging that we see it for those in-person voters, because that's a group where you might otherwise see problems. They're sort of the group that has the greatest promise for the reform and the greatest risk, because they're seeing the greatest change, right? By-mail voters, they really were intending to vote by mail ballot. The VCA experience may not change that much for them. So we would kind of expect in that sense for them to be less affected either way. So I think there was some risk that we would actually see a decline in turnout for people who were in-person voters, and the fact that we actually see a bigger average increase is really encouraging. So and it just suggests that the reform is reaching the group that we kind of would want it to reach, and having, on average, again, overall, having the effect that we would want it to have, but with the caveats that there are these groups that have had more trouble. We've had some questions about the Postal Service and whether that's a cause of concern or a source of concern. Mindy, I don't know if you want to what guidance would we offer election officials and voters in terms of coping with that problem?
Sure. Well, first off, there are a number of official sources that you can turn to, like the Secretary of State that's been putting out a lot of information through Twitter and news outlets, just telling folks what to do about their vote by mail ballot and talking about the process. But generally speaking, and we've been saying this prior to the recent revelations around the USPS, get your ballot in at least a week before, account for delays in this environment even sooner. Make sure that you, of course, if you get in on time and you feel like you are going to be okay there, because of new legislation, not only is everybody getting mailed a vote by mail ballot, but every county has to sign voters up for what's called tracking my ballot, that service. Where's my ballot? So you can actually track where your ballot is it's in the process, and you can of course see if it's actually been received, whether it's been counted. So you have that power right in your hands to make sure it's going through the process okay, and also reassure voters if somebody is thinking maybe I won't use a vote by mail ballot this year when I usually have, or maybe that I might have otherwise decided to do it because you're worried about USPS. You can sign up and track that ballot through the process, and hopefully that then won't be a factor in whether you use it or not. So we're hearing there's been public announcements around delay. We're hearing privately that there shouldn't be delays, significant delays, more than what we might normally kind of worry about. I think that still remains to be seen what's actually going to happen in November, but it's absolutely safe to mail your ballot. Just get it in maybe a little bit earlier than you might normally do and track it, is what I would say. I should make sure that let everybody know it is safe to use the post office, of course.
Yeah. And I think in other states, there's even more of a risk. In California, we actually have taken the step of extending the deadline so that if you mail in your ballot, you have to mail it by election day. So it has to be postmarked by election day. But as long as it's postmarked by election day and it arrives within now 3 weeks after the election, it will be counted. So California has taken extraordinary steps, and that is reassuring. However, I think everything you said, Mindy, like send in your ballot early if you can, and that way you have less to worry about for sure.
And I should note one other quick thing. Sometimes voters will, if it's down to the wire and you're trying to get that postmark, sometimes we do hear from voters, it's not very often, but they'll get in a box that is the word it's already been collected for the day, and it's not going to get that postmark, right? So just make sure for those of you that might fall into that category, make sure that you actually it's going to get the postmark. It hasn't been collected, take it inside the post office if that's available to you. But absolutely, if you get that postmark, it's going to be counted as long as it arrives within 17 days, we shouldn't have any issues there. So.
We've had a number of questions that are kind of run along the lines of why are these groups struggling, that we find struggling. You know, how worried should we be? Are some of these just sort of temporary blips in turnout? I guess my response to that would be, I think the philosophy that we had going into this report was to try and identify where there might be problems, and we don't really have the data to get into why different groups had any trouble. I think if a group had trouble one election and not another, or just the in-person and not the by mail, or vice versa, I think that you could interpret that as saying, well, maybe this was just a fluke and they're not going to have trouble in the future. I think our philosophy was it's better to err on the side of caution and assume that that's a sign that that group is having trouble. And so you should do the extra outreach for this fall for any group that showed signs of struggling. And I would say the main group that didn't have any trouble was habitual voters, which you wouldn't necessarily know that was true in advance. It could be that habitual voters would be so used to an existing process that they get confused by something new, but they do seem to be continuing to vote at steady rates. There's a lot of voters who fit that description. So and that helps make the overall effect of the VCA be positive, but it's just important, I think, to try and err on the side of caution, given we don't know exactly what to expect for this fall, and we're trying to sort of flag potential points of concern. I don't know, Mindy, if you had any additional thoughts about that.
I think you covered it. Agreed.
Let's see. Try to go through some of these. Could you say more about the comparisons in turnout, and like what's the comparison point? So in the report, this getting in a little bit into the nitty gritty, but we compare the turnout in those primary elections to the turnout in the 2020 fall election, and of course the 2020, sorry, I said 2020, the 2016 fall presidential election, obviously a very different kind of election, a much higher turnout than you would see in a primary of either in a presidential or a midterm election year. So lots of reasons to expect differences there. The way that we account for that is by basically looking at the differences between the counties as they existed kind of before they adopted the reform, and then taking those differences and seeing how those differences changed from the 2016 to the primaries in 2018 and 2020. And what that does is it shows you essentially the differential increase or decrease in turnout in VCA counties versus non-VCA counties. It's sort of the disproportionate change. It's not without potential question marks or points where you might criticize, but the basic method accounts for any consistent differences that we see between VCA and non-VCA counties, as well as any consistent change that occurred across all counties between the 2016 election and the 2020 election. So it accounts for an awful lot of things. And it also, because we're looking at each of these demographic groups, it allows us to sort of look at some of the nuance in that change and how it might vary across different groups of people. So, Mindy, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add.
I think you got into the weeds enough. I was checking the chat too. It looked like we got a couple of those questions, but I think they're covered.
Yeah. Let's see. Trying to see what else we were covering, kind of some general questions, a number of questions all at once.
I think we covered them.
Yeah. Oh, there's a new one.
Oh, there you go.
So there's a question, does early mail-in help if there are problems with the ballot that can be rectified? I'm seeing your high numbers of foreign language voters who may have ballots rejected. In Orange County, we have a barcode to track our vote, but that might not be widespread. I'm told if there's a question about my ballot, I will be contacted for verification. Yeah, so we do. And also says we have an amazing registrar in Orange County. That is true. Neil Kelly is an amazing registrar. I will validate that.
I second that.
Yeah. So the question is, I take that question to be sort of, can the problems with the ballot be fixed? Yes, absolutely. In California, we have what's called a curing period, where you can where the registrar can contact you and say, you have this problem with the ballot. Can you please fix it so that your ballot can be counted? And in the case of the analysis that we're doing here, ballots that didn't get fixed and ultimately didn't get counted are the ones that they're treated as not turning out. So we're only counting people whose ballots were both cast and counted in this analysis.
Yeah. And just to add a tiny bit there, it's now legally in California, it's you can cure your ballot. So if you have the wrong signature, you can fix that. And I say wrong, if you have a bad signature, you can fix that. And also if you don't have a signature, if you left it off, you can get that corrected as well. So, and then we have the extended period in terms of if it's arrives late, as long as it's postmarked. So there's lots of ability for Californians to avoid getting their ballot rejected.
Yeah, California is very, now that's not, so if anybody's listening from other states, that's not necessarily true in other states. Yeah. And we have seen some fairly high vote by mail ballot rejection rates in other states, especially the states that are struggling to manage this transition to higher vote by mail. So just to note, like if you are in another state, you shouldn't count on that kind of generous process being true for you.
And actually in California, we've even found that for new voters, the rejection rate is higher. So there is something about being completely new to the process that might make you more likely to leave your signature off or something that nature. And of course, even with the remedies now that are available through California law, a voter still has to get that message and that note from their county registrar and actually, make a correction. So we're still expecting some ballots to be rejected, but the rest of the country, we've heard some really, really high numbers in some places, and there are deep concerns around that. And part of that is potentially voters' lack of familiarity, but also very much at how those ballots are actually being processed, and that can have an impact on the high rejection rates.
Okay, we're almost done here, but I think I'm going to try to wrap two questions into one here. There was an early question that asked, since the COVID numbers are declining, should we still be worried about this? Do we need to transition to a new system? And kind of related to that, maybe there's a question: do you think that these changes in voting method will require greater efforts to protect fraud? So, sort of turning that into one question: is it worth it to transition to a new system if there is greater risk of fraud? And I don't know, Mindy, if you wanted to speak to that question.
There's not greater risk of fraud. So their research after research, at least up to this point, right, has shown consistently that voter fraud, period, is incredibly rare, and including vote by mail fraud. It's, there might be a slightly more of a chance with vote by mail that lightning will strike, but it's still incredibly rare. In a state like California, we have lots of protections for the voter to make sure that, and that's why the ballots get rejected, to make sure that ballot really is yours, that you only vote once, that your signature is verified, and so forth. So, and in other states, they have protections as well. It varies from state to state in terms of how ballots are processed. But period, even with the higher numbers of vote by mail, we have no evidence to suggest that those higher numbers of vote by mail would allow for greater fraud.
Okay, I think, yeah, I mean, I guess the only thing I would add to that is I think by contrast, COVID is real, and the risk is still there, even though the numbers are declining. The numbers are declining because we're taking good precautions, and there's always the risk of a flare up if we're not careful. So I think that takes us to the end of the time. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. Again, the slides and the report and technical appendices for the report will all be available at www.ppic.org. Thank you.
Thank you.